So our last speaker in this section, and then we'll take a short break and have another section of speakers. But the last speaker for this section is Emily Murphy. Professor Murphy's research focuses on the intersection of neuroscience, behavioral science, and the law. She writes about the use of neuroscience as evidence and how neuroscience and behavioral science shape public policy and legal systems. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in Stanford Law Review, and amongst many others. Professor Murphy has a PhD in behavioral neuroscience and psychopharmacology from the University of Cambridge Trinity College and her JD from Stanford Law School. Prior to law school, amongst many other things on her resume, she was a postdoc with the Stanford Law School Center for Law and the Biosciences, as well as the MacArthur Foundation's Law and Neuroscience Project. Thanks.
Thank you, Anya, for hosting, and thank you, University of Iowa School of Law, and the incredible hospitality we get here. And it's always really nice to visit. So I'm an interloper in this conference, and I sold my work to this crowd as regulation via the biosciences, perhaps. And so I'm going to give you a big picture framework for what I think is my research agenda going forward. And to give you the background, though, I've been working in law and neuroscience for a while now, and the field is still young and growing, and there's a lot of questions like, what does it do? It has been working mostly in the area of adjudication, evidence, very courtroom focused, either ex post decisions about why an individual behaved the way they did or what should we be doing with this category of individuals, rarely in the juvenile context, or some ex ante individual prediction, maybe we should or shouldn't do this, but super courtroom focused. There's a lot more, though, to behavioral and brain science than kind of guessing or questioning or deciding how individuals are going to behave or why they did behave the way they did. And from where I sit, a major point of doing all the basic science research in brain and behavioral science is to better understand not just the extremes of the human condition, but like the normal part of the human condition and all the things that affect it and affect our daily lives. And that research is at its strongest, empirically speaking, when we do it at the group level. Translating it to individuals, incredibly challenging. Humans are very messy. Group level, we have a better grip on things. And we're particularly seeing this. I'm so excited for the work that's going on in big data and brain imaging and behavioral science, starting to show us that we need data sets that are absolutely massive to make brain behavior understandings, but also just published as a preprint as of yesterday, looking at how executive function comes online using a really complex meta-analysis of 4 different data sets of massive tens and tens and tens of thousands of patients. Executive functioning seems to be online late age 18. Like, it's not 25. It's not like when your brain stops developing. We're learning things by aggregating huge amounts of data. What should we do with this? Well, I've been looking for quite some time now for a bigger, kind of deeper theoretical framework for law and neuroscience, behavioral science. And I think I've found it. And I don't think it exists in private law. I think it exists more in the domain of administrative law, public law, and governance. And this is also this framework that I am putting forward as a theoretical model is also kind of a critique of what behavioral economics has been doing, because that has influenced what is called behavioral public policy. But I also argue that has been rather limited in scope and in impact. And also is a sort of an incomplete model for human behavior, but also an incomplete spectrum of data that we can make use of. So what am I talking about? What I'm calling collective cognitive capital is a naming and framing project, but here is the core claim. We can and we should use brain and behavioral science to evaluate policy decisions by how they affect the cognitive and emotional functioning of the people. We should make our lives better. And how do we make our lives better? We make our lives better by thinking about how it affects cognitive and emotional functioning. And I mean this both over the lifetime, of course, but also in the acute phase. So let me break this down. And I'm going to take the terms in reverse because this is also, as a naming and framing concept, deliberately alliterative. And so I will explain why I chose these terms in reverse. Why am I calling this capital? I think capital is a metaphor, an imperfect metaphor, but an important metaphor, because if this idea is to function as I think it should, as a slightly as an alternative to, maybe supplement to, and maybe displacement of analytical techniques like cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis, we need to speak the language of that analysis. And I also think the metaphor of capital is useful. Capital, we see it in social capital, human capital, cultural capital. It's an idea that we're comfortable with, and even though it's not perfect. It requires investment. It's capable of growth, subject to fluctuations depending on conditions, and harmed by underinvestment or withdrawals. I think this is a fair characterization of how our brains function. Cognitive, I am using expansively. We'll call it here derived from brain states. What I mean is to narrower than that. Lots of things are derived from brain states, including things we don't want to enhance or aggregate or improve upon. I mean not just the narrow sense of cognitive as in computational type cognitive. I also mean social and emotional regulatory functions. I will give you a model next of like the sort of 4 domains of data I see working here. Collective. This is actually a very important part of the thinking about this, that this is not an individualizable metric or index, both because the group-based data is where it comes from. Group-based data should lead to group-based theories and models, but also, which I think aligns with both with emerging like constitutional theorists, we're talking more about what do we mean by general welfare and some collective rights theories, but also that there is an emergent property in our collective consciousness. This is a sort of Deweyan idea that we work well and better in our brain. We do more things when we are communicating, when we are cognating, when we are supplementing our cognition together. So how would it work? I have done the naming and framing part. I have identified these 4 major domains where I think data could be sort of aggregated into these buckets of 1, development and plasticity, and cognitive reserve in the upper left and lower right. These are the kind of biological parts of this taxonomy that currently behavioral economics doesn't even think about. Like there's just no incorporation of types, and these types of function are deeply affected by things that we regulate. Environment, nutrition, education, all of these things that can deeply impact both development and plasticity in terms of children's education, cognitive reserve in terms of acute stress and trauma and things like that, The other more functional components being general intelligence and fluid reasoning. We have a lot of data on this. That's not to say that data is not controversial, but these are things we have large amounts of data about. And cognitive control, including emotional and social regulatory abilities. This is where I see like executive function being a huge part of this. If we can meta-analyze this, we might be able to build indices or at least a consensus model of what an analytical framework would look like. There are many limitations, caveats, and risks. Primary among them is that it's going to be very hard to agree upon what this should look like. The data is necessarily sort of unfortunately incomplete, but maybe this becomes a call for applied brain and behavioral science research. There are huge risks. Inherently, I think there's a risk of individualization and possibly misuse, stigmatization of groups, and there's a misunderstanding of the concept as being used to rank or prioritize. And so this conceptual model is at an early stage, but I see it touching on many different areas of law, mostly in the public law sector. And I am looking for fellow travelers to join me on this path as I write this book and figure out what's next. So I appreciate your attention and thank you.